The Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War, pushing the world to the edge of nuclear war. While later accounts often credited its peaceful resolution to American strength and the leadership of President John F. Kennedy, the reality was far more complex. The crisis began taking shape in the fall of 1961, when the United States deployed 15 Jupiter medium-range missiles near Izmir, Turkey. Each missile could carry a nuclear warhead with a destructive force about 100 times greater than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. From these positions, Moscow was only a 10-minute flight away. To Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, the deployment was an intolerable threat, handing the Americans a decisive strategic advantage. The Soviet Union, he believed, had to respond. That same year, Cold War tensions were rising sharply. In June 1961, Khrushchev met Kennedy for the first time in Vienna. The talks only deepened the rift between the two leaders. On the issue of Germany, Khrushchev repeated his demand that the Western powers abandon West Berlin, an enclave of freedom within the communist bloc, and an escape route for thousands fleeing the GDR. Kennedy refused. As Berlin was a constant irritation to the Soviet bloc, Cuba had become a similar problem for the United States. 2 years earlier, Fidel Castro had seized power and aligned closely with the Soviet Union. Kennedy feared this new communist government could endure and inspire similar movements across Latin America. Determined to remove Castro, he was willing to consider almost any measure.
We do not intend to be lectured on intervention by those whose character was stamped for all time on the bloody streets of Budapest. Cuba must not be abandoned to the communists, and we do not intend to abandon it either.
In April 1961, Kennedy approved the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which Cuban exiles, supported by the CIA, tried to overthrow Castro. The operation collapsed within days, leaving more than 1,300 men killed, wounded, or captured. Khrushchev responded with a blunt warning. The USSR would provide Cuba with any assistance needed to repel an armed attack. Kennedy escalated efforts to destabilize Cuba. By late 1961, he authorized Operation Mongoose, a wide-ranging covert campaign run from the CIA's Miami base with a $50 million budget and 400 agents. Its goals included economic sabotage, propaganda, and even plans to assassinate Castro. Military planners drew up scenarios to justify an invasion, from staged incidents on U.S. soil to the sinking of a refugee boat bound for Florida, which could then be blamed on Havana. The CIA even considered tampering with Castro's cigars, lacing them with poison or explosives. While Kennedy's focus was on undermining Cuba, Khrushchev took steps in Europe. In August 1961, the East German government, with Soviet backing, closed the crossings into West Berlin with barbed wire and makeshift barricades, later replaced by the Berlin Wall. Kennedy answered this move with the deployment of Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara defended the decision, but for Khrushchev, the provocation was obvious. The United States already had a massive nuclear advantage, nearly 25,000 warheads to the USSR's 2,500. Khrushchev began looking for a way to restore the balance. "What if we put one of our hedgehogs in the Americans' pants?" he asked his defense minister. The hedgehog was a nuclear missile, and the pants were Cuba. Deploying Soviet nuclear weapons there would both secure the island and signaled to Washington that the USSR could respond directly to American actions near its borders. Castro accepted the plan but pushed for a formal agreement, arguing that Cuba had the right to possess nuclear weapons openly. Khrushchev disagreed, insisting on secrecy to avoid triggering an American reaction before the missiles were ready. By June 1962, Khrushchev had convinced the Soviet Presidium to proceed. He claimed that U.S. forces were preparing to invade Cuba, and that Moscow needed to make clear that such an attack would mean facing not just Cuba's defenses, but the nuclear power of the Soviet Union itself. Operation Anadyr was set in motion, the largest covert military operation of the Cold War. More than 50,000 troops, 60 nuclear-capable missiles of varying ranges, bombers, and other military equipment would be shipped to Cuba aboard disguised civilian freighters. Secrecy was strict. Soldiers did not know their destination, and even the captains of the 85 cargo ships opened their sealed orders only after setting sail. Plans also included stationing submarines armed with ballistic missiles off the Cuban coast. Despite these precautions, U.S. intelligence soon detected unusual Soviet shipping patterns. Sea Director John McCone, appointed after the Bay of Pigs disaster, noted the arrival of 21 Soviet freighters in Cuba by July 1962. At an August 10th meeting, he warned Kennedy that Moscow might be preparing to deploy nuclear missiles to the island. The warning drew little attention in the White House. Kennedy considered it possible that anti-aircraft missiles had been sent to Cuba, but saw such defensive weapons as no threat to the United States. Even so, he ordered reconnaissance flights to track Soviet shipping. In early August, dozens of nuclear warheads arrived in Cuba. Around the same time, McCone left for his honeymoon on the Côte d'Azur, but kept a close watch on developments. Without concrete proof of what the freighters carried, he nevertheless became convinced that nuclear missiles were already on the island. In early September, CIA Director John McCone wrote to his deputy that it was entirely possible the Soviets were attempting to hide the presence of offensive nuclear missiles in Cuba. A few days later, he sent another cable urging a careful investigation into the likelihood of a covert deployment of multiple Soviet medium-range missiles. His warnings fell on deaf ears. McCone's messages were dismissed as honeymoon cables, a reference to the fact that he was sending them while away on his honeymoon. To make matters worse, the agency issued a report directly contradicting him, declaring that such a deployment was unlikely. Back in Washington, McCone remained deeply concerned. With little official attention given to the matter, aerial reconnaissance flights over Cuba had been halted. On October 9th, McCone persuaded President Kennedy to resume them. It was not until October 14th that a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft from Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida took off, equipped with high-resolution cameras to capture as much intelligence as possible over the island. The images it returned left no doubt. Launch sites for offensive missiles capable of striking the United States were under construction in Cuba. Even more alarming, these missiles could be fitted with nuclear warheads. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy chose to wait until the morning of October 16th before informing Kennedy. The president was stunned. He had not believed Khrushchev would take such a bold step. Meeting privately with his brother and advisor Robert Kennedy, the president vented his anger, calling the Soviet leader a gangster and a liar. The intelligence community, in his view, had failed. Only McCone had tried unsuccessfully to alert the White House in time. Now the missiles were in place and operational. Although the new discovery did not dramatically alter the nuclear balance, the USSR already had missiles capable of striking the United States. the development was deeply unsettling. Nuclear weapons in Cuba could enable Fidel Castro to launch a direct strike on American territory. There were also fears that the move might be linked to Soviet ambitions in Berlin. West Berlin's survival depended on the American nuclear shield, and if Kennedy failed to act decisively, Khrushchev might feel free to advance into the Allied-controlled sector. On October 16th, Kennedy convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. Members included Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and Robert Kennedy. A secret recording system, installed in the White House at Kennedy's request, captured the discussions.
But we can expect you would have to have in the back of your own mind whatever decision you take, the possibility, the likelihood of a Soviet reaction somewhere else, running all the way from Berlin right around to Korea, and the possibility of a reaction against the United States itself, that no one can surely foresee the outcome.
President Kennedy responds,
Had we done nothing, communism casters have been spread through the hemisphere as governments frightened by this new evidence of power had toppled.
From the outset, most participants agreed that the Soviet missile sites in Cuba had to be eliminated. Several options were considered. Kennedy favored a limited surgical strike, while McNamara supported a larger attack that would also target Cuban air bases. Robert Kennedy argued for an invasion to remove Castro once and for all. The meeting ended without a clear decision. The timing could not have been worse for the president. The midterm elections were approaching, and Kennedy had campaign stops scheduled in Connecticut the following day. Canceling them would raise suspicion and alert the press. The Cuban situation had now become his highest priority, but it had to remain secret.
The fact of the matter is that the great fight in 1962 is the same fight that we waged in 1960 and must be waged in this decade. And that is to provide employment for our people, education for our children, and security for our older citizens. And that job, in my opinion, can only be done by the Democratic Party.
Kennedy traveled to Stratford, Connecticut, moving from rally to rally, while events unfolded behind the scenes. In Moscow, Khrushchev and Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko were preparing their next move. On October 18th, Gromyko arrived in Washington for a long-planned diplomatic visit, a perfect opportunity for discreet talks. During their meeting, Kennedy mentioned the number of Soviet freighters that had recently arrived in Cuba, but did not reveal that the United States knew their cargo. Khrushchev had kept Gromyko in the dark about the nuclear missile deliveries. The Soviet foreign minister assured Kennedy that Soviet assistance to Cuba was purely defensive and never intended to provide the island with nuclear weapons capable of reaching the United States. Kennedy maintained his composure. Meanwhile, Khrushchev's plan was advancing. Missile deliveries continued, and Soviet submarines moved into position near Cuba. The next day, October 19th, Kennedy met with his top military commanders to hear their assessment. They argued that an airstrike alone could not guarantee the complete destruction of the missiles. The only sure solution, they said, was to invade Cuba. Ongoing military exercises on Florida's beaches, they added, demonstrated the United States' overwhelming strength and could be turned into a full-scale assault within days. Kennedy rejected the plan. As leader of the free world, he felt he could not justify an unprovoked invasion of a smaller nation, especially given the risk of Soviet retaliation. After the meeting, he remarked to an advisor, "If we listen to you and do what you want, none of us will be alive later to tell you that you were wrong." On October 20th and 21st, Kennedy convened 2 meetings of the National Security Council. In these sessions, he announced his decision. The Soviet freighters bound for Cuba would be stopped. A naval quarantine, effectively a blockade, would be imposed on the island. 7 days had passed since the first photographs confirmed the presence of nuclear missiles in Cuba. Daily life continued as normal. The public remained unaware of the danger. But secrecy would not last. Kennedy prepared to go on radio and television on the evening of October 22nd to address the nation. The day before, he sent former Secretary of State Dean Acheson to Europe to brief NATO allies directly. Though presented with a fait accompli, the Europeans gave Kennedy their support. The entire White House press operation was mobilized to emphasize the importance of the coming announcement. To avoid completely blindsiding Moscow, Secretary of State Dean Rusk met Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin at 6 p.m. on October 22nd. He handed him a copy of the president's speech an hour before Kennedy was to deliver it. Dobrynin was visibly shaken. He had received no prior information about the deployment of medium-range missiles in Cuba. "The facts are now on the table," President Kennedy declared. The world now knew of the nuclear threat to the United States. He demanded an immediate halt to the Soviet operation, warning that failure to comply would result in sweeping retaliatory measures. Kennedy announced a naval quarantine of Cuba. Every vessel, regardless of its flag, would be stopped and turned back if found carrying offensive weapons. The address sent a shockwave of fear across the globe. In American cities, people rushed to stockpile food and water, while fallout shelters were prepared for use. From the Vatican, Pope John issued a solemn appeal urging humanity to do all it could to preserve peace and avert the horrors that lay ahead. On the morning of October 23rd, Khrushchev replied to Kennedy's speech in a brief but pointed letter. He denounced the quarantine as aggressive, a violation of the United Nations Charter, and an attack on the principle of freedom of navigation. He insisted the weapons in Cuba were purely defensive and warned that the American measures could have catastrophic consequences for world peace. At the same time, he placed the armed forces of the Eastern Bloc on alert. In the United States, preparations for potential conflict accelerated. More than 40 U.S. naval vessels headed toward the Caribbean. At the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, an American enclave in southern Cuba, families of military personnel were evacuated to the mainland. While much of the world braced for war, Khrushchev attended a performance at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow, appearing calm and composed, as though an evening of opera could soften the gravity of the unfolding crisis. On October 24th, at 10 a.m., the naval quarantine officially began. Within hours, the first Soviet vessels were expected to reach the blockade line formed by U.S. warships. At the same time, the American military raised its readiness to DEFCON 2, the highest alert short of nuclear war. All U.S. nuclear forces worldwide were placed on standby. A direct military clash now seemed possible. The tension was palpable. Kennedy considered the dangerous question: what if Soviet ships attempted to break through? Would the standoff lead to open combat? Among the vessels approaching Cuba were 4 carrying nuclear warheads, a fact unknown to the president. Khrushchev, however, had already ordered them to turn back, judging that enough warheads had already been delivered to the island. His order did not apply to every ship. Other Soviet freighters, kept moving toward the blockade line, apparently willing to challenge it. One of them, the tanker Bucharest, was shadowed by the U.S. Navy, a destroyer prepared to intercept and board her. Tension peaked when the Soviet captain responded over the radio, claiming his cargo was only fuel. Assessing that it was unlikely to be carrying offensive weapons, the Americans allowed the ship to pass. The first day of the quarantine ended without direct confrontation, to the relief of the National Security Council. Kennedy, however, remained cautious, convinced the standoff was far from over. At the United Nations, Soviet Ambassador Valerian Zorin accused the United States of piracy. U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson confronted him in a dramatic exchange, presenting photographs from American reconnaissance flights. The images clearly showed missile launch sites in Cuba, convincing many observers that the USSR had initiated the escalation. Khrushchev now sought a diplomatic path forward. He wanted to halt the spiral in which a single incident could ignite global war. On October 25th, he gathered the Presidium of the Central Committee in Moscow. He was prepared to remove the missiles from Cuba if Kennedy would promise not to invade the island. Khrushchev's main goal from the start, to secure Cuba's place as a permanent socialist outpost in the Western Hemisphere. The next evening, the U.S. government received a letter from Khrushchev. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara would later call it the most extraordinary diplomatic message I had ever seen. In it, Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba, while also warning of the catastrophic risks of nuclear war. Kennedy was encouraged. The letter suggested that his Soviet counterpart was ready to negotiate. But on the evening of October 26th, a second, more formal letter emerged from Moscow. This time, Khrushchev's demands had grown. In addition to security guarantees for Cuba, he now wanted the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The letter's contents were broadcast by Radio Moscow before it even reached the White House, ensuring that the world and the Western press heard the demand immediately. On the morning of October 27th, Kennedy read his intelligence briefings and learned the new letter was on its way. He could understand Khrushchev's logic. If the United States objected to Soviet missiles in Cuba because of their proximity, it was reasonable for the USSR to oppose American missiles stationed in Turkey. Most of Kennedy's advisers, however, rejected the new proposal. They urged him to accept only the terms outlined in the first letter, the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for a non-invasion pledge. That day, tension reached a new peak. An American U-2 reconnaissance plane, gathering air samples over the Arctic, strayed deep into Soviet airspace. Soviet radar detected it, and fighter jets were scrambled to intercept. In response, the U.S. Air Force dispatched its own fighters to protect the aircraft, jets armed with nuclear weapons due to the DEFCON 2 alert. For several tense minutes, the U-2 was within reach of Soviet MiGs before finally clearing Soviet airspace. When Kennedy heard about the incident, he muttered, "There's always one son of a bitch who doesn't get the word." Khrushchev was equally unsettled. An American aircraft intruding so deeply into Soviet territory could have triggered a chain reaction toward disaster. Just hours later, another blow came. A U.S. reconnaissance plane over Cuba was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile unit acting on its own initiative, defying orders from Moscow. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, was killed instantly. Fidel Castro became convinced that an American airstrike on Cuba was imminent. In urgent desperation, he sent Khrushchev a telegram urging him to consider launching a nuclear strike. The Soviet leader was taken aback. Kennedy, for his part, rejected any retaliatory measures. In both Washington and Moscow, leaders understood that a single misstep could ignite a global catastrophe. One incident in particular highlighted the fragility of the situation. Soviet submarines were still operating within the quarantine zone, shadowed by the U.S. Navy. Two surfaced and were quickly identified. A third, the submarine B-59, remained submerged. It had left port 3 weeks earlier and, since arriving in the Sargasso Sea, had lost all contact with Moscow. Its radio operator intercepted only fragments of American news broadcasts, leaving the crew unsure whether World War III had already begun. Conditions aboard were grim. Designed for Arctic waters, the submarine lacked a cooling system. Inside, temperatures climbed to nearly 104 Fahrenheit, and oxygen was running dangerously low. On October 27th, the U.S. Navy detected the vessel. To compel it to surface, American forces dropped practice depth charges. Believing he was under attack and that war had already started, the Soviet commander prepared to launch a 5-kiloton nuclear torpedo. At the last moment, second-in-command Vasily Arkhipov persuaded him to hold fire and surface instead. The world had narrowly avoided disaster. After this close call, Kennedy sought a diplomatic resolution. With his advisers, he drafted a proposal to engage with the Soviet Union's terms. He assumed, however, that Khrushchev would reject any offer that did not include removing U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Though many advisers opposed it, Kennedy was prepared to make that concession. The challenge was managing the reaction from NATO allies, who relied on those weapons as a deterrent against Soviet aggression. In a smaller meeting, Kennedy announced his decision to grant Khrushchev's request. Secretary of State Dean Rusk suggested a way to protect NATO's image. The United States would promise to remove the missiles, but only after the crisis had ended. Robert Kennedy was tasked with delivering this message to Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. This way, the Soviets would get what they wanted without the United States appearing to yield publicly. Robert Kennedy assured Dobrynin that dismantling the missiles would take 4 to 5 months, the minimum time needed under NATO procedures. He emphasized that the arrangement must remain confidential and gave the ambassador a direct phone number to the White House for Khrushchev's response. The fate of the crisis now lay in Moscow's hands. When Khrushchev received the offer, he was surprised. He had not expected Kennedy to agree to remove the Jupiter missiles and had been preparing to confirm a previous, less generous proposal. Without delay, he sent instructions to Dobrynin to accept. Soon afterward, Radio Moscow announced that the Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. guarantee of Cuba's security, omitting any mention of the missiles in Turkey. On October 28th, the crisis came to an end. News reached Washington at 9 a.m. Relief swept through the White House, and most of Kennedy's advisers congratulated him. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, however, were reluctant to abandon their invasion plans. Kennedy was troubled by their reaction. Around the world, Kennedy's apparent victory was celebrated. In the public's eyes, he had forced the Soviet Union to back down. The peaceful resolution paved the way for a period of détente between Washington and Moscow. A direct hotline was established between the two capitals, and several treaties aimed at limiting the spread of nuclear weapons were signed. In 1963, Secretary of State Dean Rusk met Khrushchev on the Black Sea coast, a symbolic gesture of the easing tensions. Yet Kennedy's triumph was not as absolute as it seemed. The crisis might never have erupted without years of American pressure on Cuba. Initially, Castro was angered by Khrushchev's decision, but in 1963 he repaired relations by making an official visit to the USSR. Khrushchev's central objective, ensuring Cuba's survival against U.S. attack, was achieved, and the communist government remains in power to this day. As for the missiles in Turkey, in February 1963, McNamara and Rusk testified before Congress that their removal had nothing to do with any deal involving Cuba. This preserved Kennedy's political standing and the image of American resolve toward communism. Khrushchev, ousted from power in 1964, gained no lasting political benefit. The secret agreement would not be revealed until 1969. In understanding the Cuban Missile Crisis, every detail matters, for it is in the details that the narrow escape from catastrophe becomes clear.